We often use the term Jewish with broad connotations. We'll of course remember Abraham and Sarah as the patriarch and matriarch of the entire Jewish people. We'll remember that Moses was called by God to save Israel from slavery in Egypt, bringing the Jewish people out of slavery and bringing them into their own land. We'll say quite rightly that Jesus was Jewish, that Mary and Joseph were Jewish, that Peter and Paul were Jewish. All the first Christians were Jewish, but within a few decades of Jesus' death and resurrection, the Jewish followers of Jesus were becoming much different from the Jews who weren't followers of Jesus, and so they began exiting their synagogues and forming their own Christian fellowships. Today, there are Christian churches and Jewish synagogues in towns and cities across America and in most of the Western world. And while we all have varying degrees of interfaith, interreligious dialogues and relationships, the two faiths are distinct. But the Jews of today are different from the Jews of Jesus' day. The Jews of Jesus' day were different from the Jews that Moses rescued from Egypt. And the Jews who were rescued from Egypt were different from the Jews who were the children of Abraham and Sarah. Judaism as a faith grew, it changed, it developed, and it's grown and changed and developed for the better part of 4,000 years. This should make sense because we know that Christianity has changed and grown throughout the centuries and millennia. If you were to somehow take some of the first Christians who were worshiping in illegal church gatherings, which met secretly in people's homes, and you transported them into a medieval European cathedral, I mean, they would be absolutely blown away. And if you transported some medieval European Christians into a modern Christian megachurch, they'd be like, and what exactly is this? The Judaism of Jesus' day was a particular period of Judaism called Second Temple Judaism. And to understand Jesus as the Jewish Messiah in the 1st century AD, and to understand the Prologue to John written at the end of that same century, you really do need to understand the questions, the ideas, the motivations, and the spirituality of Second Temple Judaism. And that is where we're going to go next. In the book of Exodus, shortly after the Israelites were freed from their enslavement in Egypt, and they found themselves in the wilderness, God gave them the 10 Commandments. And then almost immediately after that, God began to give them the exact specifications for the tabernacle that He wanted them to build. The instructions for this mobile shrine are incredibly detailed, but in the most basic of terms, there was to be a large outer court, and then a tent structure with 2 rooms, an outer sanctum and an inner sanctum. The inner sanctum was to be in the shape of a cube. There is a definite hierarchy of sacredness going on. The outer court was sacred, but not quite as sacred as the outer sanctum. But as sacred as the outer sanctum was, it was nowhere near as sacred as the inner sanctum. In the outer court, there was an altar, not a table altar like we're used to seeing in churches today, but a great big grill where a fire would have been raging and where the sacrificed meat would have been laid upon to be consumed by the fire. In the inner sanctum, often called the Holy of Holies, there was one piece of furniture, the Ark of the Covenant. It was a wooden box wrapped in gold. Inside the box was kept the tablets of the 10 Commandments, Moses' staff, and some pieces of manna. On top of the box were 2 gold angels, cherubim to be exact, which faced inward. In any other shrine in the ancient Near East, that spot in the center between the angels would have been the place where an idol would have stood, a physical representation of the god. But on the ark, there is, of course, no idol. There is only an empty spot, and it's in that empty spot where God Almighty actually dwelt. The top of the ark is called the mercy seat, and it's the place where the presence of God rested amongst his people. After the tabernacle was constructed, a kind of amazing thing happened. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Exodus 38, verses 34 and 35. It wasn't just a nice little mobile church setup. It was the dwelling place of God on earth, where God's presence was actually and visibly present. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Remember those words, glory and tabernacle. When the Israelites made it to the Promised Land, and after they established a monarchy, King Solomon actually got around to constructing a permanent temple structure in the capital city of Jerusalem. And when he had it constructed, it was fashioned almost identically to the tabernacle before it. There was an outer court with an altar. There was an outer sanctum, and there was a cube-shaped inner sanctum with the Ark of the Covenant. It was made of stone and covered in precious metals. It was not made to be a mobile shrine where it could be broken down and set up again later in another spot. It was larger than the tabernacle, but in every way that was important, it was identical to the tabernacle in the wilderness. And the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. 2 Chronicles 5:14. Again, the presence of God was right there. The glory of the Lord filled the house of the temple. See that word again? Glory. Now, there's a lot going on in the construction and architecture of the tabernacle and the temple, but one of the most important things is that it mirrored creation. Symbolically and artistically, the outer court represented the earth, the land, and the sea. The outer sanctum represented the visible sky, and the inner sanctum represented the invisible heavens, the dwelling place of God and the heavenly host of angels. The tabernacle in the wilderness and the temple in Jerusalem were a miniature representation of the entire created order, all things visible and invisible. Theologically, spiritually, the message here is kind of clear. God created it all and reigns over it all. Even though the tabernacle and the temple were specific structures set in specific places, they echoed the whole of the cosmos. And God set priests to minister in his creation. In the tabernacle and the temple, there were actual professional priests who performed priestly duties, ministering in the presence of God Almighty. In the beginning of creation, God set Adam and Eve as the priests over the Garden of Eden, which also echoes all of creation in the same way. In fact, the language that would describe their role in Eden would be echoed exactly by the language that would describe the role of the temple priesthood in the later parts of the Old Testament. Almost 600 years before Jesus was born, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. It was completely desecrated and dismantled by King Nebuchadnezzar and the army of Babylon. For 70 years, the surviving Israelites lived in Babylon. Their temple was no more, and they weren't even there in their homeland where their temple once stood. But eventually, Babylon was defeated by King Cyrus and the Persians, and King Cyrus had no desire to keep the Israelites from their homeland anymore, so he released them and sent them home. And he even gave them money to rebuild their land and their city and their temple. And so they did. And this new temple is called the Second Temple. At first, it was kind of small. Cyrus had given them funds, but not enough to deck the temple out in the gold and finery that it had in its former years. And at this point in their history, they had a whole city, a whole nation to rebuild, so they couldn't focus all their energy on the temple. So at first, the Second Temple was kind of a humble temple, but as the years would go on, they would take to sprucing it up and enlarging it every so often. Before Jesus was born, just before he was born, King Herod took it upon himself to dramatically enlarge and beautify the temple until it rivaled the most splendid temples of the Roman Empire. But it's still just the Second Temple. When the rabbis got together to talk about the state of the people of God, they talked about their temple, and they remarked, as is recorded in many ancient documents, that this Second Temple was different in many ways from that first temple that Solomon had built. Some of the pieces of furniture weren't there anymore, most notably the Ark of the Covenant, once the crown jewel of the temple, the vessel upon which rested the presence of God. It was gone. In fact, no one knows what happened to it to this day. Though there was this one guy who thought that he might know. But the rabbis knew something else was missing too, something that was actually more important than even the ark. The cloud, the smoke, the visible presence of God, the glory. And this distressed the rabbis of the Second Temple period. So much so that they believed that the most important undertaking of their time was to see the temple renewed. Not in the glitzy way that Herod had in mind. They wanted to see it spiritually renewed so that God's presence would come amongst them physically and visibly as it had before. God used to dwell with them, and now they wondered, where is God? In 70 AD, the temple was again destroyed, this time by the Romans. They utterly demolished it so that one stone would not be found standing upon another stone. Then they came back and literally removed tens of thousands of pounds of soil and rock from the top of the Temple Mount, grinding the mountain down so that even the earth that the temple stood upon wasn't there anymore. Jews fled Jerusalem as Rome had her way with it. Many of them traveled north to Syria, where a large number of Jews set up a kind of mini Jerusalem in exile in the city of Antioch. Some of those who were there were some of the priests of the former temple. Some of them had rescued some of the sacred objects from the temple before it was destroyed. And they had a plan. And it was kind of similar to the plan they had begun to hatch a few decades prior. They wanted to renew the temple. Of course, now they'd have to rebuild the temple before it could be renewed. But many of them felt that if they lived faithfully according to Torah and if they prayed, that God would bless their efforts and that they would victoriously return to Jerusalem, where they would construct a new temple and God would dwell in their midst once more. Of course, that would never happen. At least not as of the making of this video. To this day, there is no temple. In fact, the exact location of the former temple is unknown and disputed. So even if it was possible in the political crucible of the Middle East to rebuild it, No one knows exactly where they would even break ground. But the ancient rabbis knew the scriptures. Ezekiel 43, the final and grand vision of the book that bears his name, shows the glory of God returning to the temple. In Isaiah chapters 40 through 55, there are multiple references to the divine glory returning to the temple. And when those who are watching see it, what they see isn't a cloud this time, but a servant, the manifestation of the glory of God as a servant. In the two major post-Babylonian exile books of the Bible, Zechariah and Malachi, they show versions of the temple being rebuilt, but the people are still waiting for the glory to return. Okay, this is a course on the prologue to John, so you might be wondering why we're talking about the temple. Well, here's the thing. In verse 14 of the prologue, we find these words, which are by now probably very familiar to us. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We've talked a lot about the Word. We've talked some about flesh too, how in Greek it literally means meat. But now we have to talk about dwelt. In the prologue, the Greek word that John used for dwelt here is skinu. It really doesn't mean dwelt or lived among as it is oftentimes translated. It literally means tabernacled. In fact, in the Greek version of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, as we heard in the last session, skinu is the word used for the tabernacle in the wilderness. Moses constructed a skinu. As it reads in the prologue, John treats it as a verb rather than a noun. It's not that Jesus showed up in a tabernacle, Jesus tabernacled. There are other ways that John could have said that Jesus took on skin and bone and lived among us if that's what he wanted to say, but that's not what he said. He said that Jesus tabernacled among us. NT Wright, Bishop of the Church of England and one of the most prominent New Testament scholars of this day, says that what John is doing here is writing a new, updated temple theology. John here is answering the main Second Temple Judaism issue of renewing the temple. And of course, he's not talking about the building made of stone and mortar. John is talking about Jesus. Notice again the full text of verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt, tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son. The Word tabernacles among us, and what do we see? The glory. The glory. What John is saying is that the temple has been renewed and the glory of God is visible once again, just not in cloud and smoke, but now in the flesh and bones of Jesus Christ. NT Wright then notes that this temple theology, explicitly laid out in the prologue, continues throughout the Gospel of John. In the second chapter of John, Jesus explicitly identifies himself as the temple. In John 10, Jesus is at the temple for the festival of the dedication of the temple, and there's a subtle reference to the importance of the Messiah being there for this auspicious occasion. When the women arrive at Jesus' tomb on Easter morning, in John's Gospel, they find two angels, each of them sitting on opposite sides of the stone slab that his body had just been lying on. Does that sound familiar? Two angels turned inward, facing an empty place where the presence of God dwelt on earth? The Judaism of the early first century was heartbroken over the absence of the glory of God in the temple that stood in Jerusalem. And the Judaism of the late first century was just as devastated over the total loss of the temple altogether. For over 1,000 years, God had dwelt with his people in a special and unique way in the tabernacle and then in the temple, and all of that was now gone. The structure which anchored the faith of God's people had been destroyed. And what John seems to be saying in his gospel in general and in the prologue in particular is that the glory of God didn't abandon us. The location of the glory had just shifted. And the glory was now no longer confined to one building in one city of one country, confined within the religious structure of one people. Now, the glory of God has been released fully for all the people in all the world. A glory which is for the whole cosmos, which is, of course, exactly what the theology and spirituality of the temple have been pointing us towards for the whole time, which is probably why the prologue is so grand and cosmic. It's not focusing us in on one place. It's lifting our gaze to see the glory of Christ, the Word and the light, who fills all things.